Hey guys, tonight we slip into the shadowed corridors of the ancient Byzantine Empire. A world of glittering mosaics, perfumed chambers, and endless paperwork. You are here standing under the grand arches of Constantinople. The air smells faintly of parchment and beeswax. Everywhere you turn, clerks shuffle through scrolls as tall as themselves, scribes hunched over their desks, and messengers dart through narrow halls like anxious ferrets. It's not the swords or chariots that keep this empire running, it's paper seals and silk ribbons. You take a step forward only to nearly trip over a stack of petitions waiting to be approved by some official whose name you can't pronounce. Every request, from buying a donkey to opening a bakery, requires layers upon layers of documentation, each more confusing than the last. You begin to realize that in Byzantium, survival depends less on strength and more on your ability to navigate this suffocating sea of bureaucracy. Honestly, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle deeper into the administrative heart of the city, your sandals slapping softly against the polished marble floors. Ahead looms the great palace, but it's not the emperor you're here to see. It's the gears that make his empire turn. You pass rows of officials seated behind ornate wooden desks. They wear silk tunics embroidered with complex patterns that practically scream, "I'm important." Each desk holds scrolls, wax seals, and small knives for cutting ribbons. Yes, ribbons. Even at this early stage, you're already encountering the infamous red tape. Literally. These crimson silk ribbons tied around documents and sealed with wax are the ancestors of the modern phrase. And you're about to find out why Byzantium needed so many of them. The sheer scale of record-keeping here is staggering. The city itself is a living organism of bureaucracy. You see tax collectors comparing scrolls, military officers double-checking muster rolls, and merchants desperately waiving permits in hopes of gaining entry to the harbor. You overhear a merchant complain, 3 weeks just to get permission to import olive oil. Another responds, 3 weeks, lucky. I've been waiting since Pentecost. One nervous young clerk dashes by you, nearly dropping a pile of scrolls. The exactor wants these filed before Vespers, he squeaks, disappearing into another chamber. You realize quickly, this isn't inefficiency. This is control. Byzantine rulers learned long ago that paperwork could do what swords couldn't bind people to the system. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine obsession with records was genius governance or bureaucratic madness. Some say it was essential for keeping the vast multicultural empire together. Others suggest it smothered innovation and bred corruption. Honestly, both might be true. The sound of scratching quills fills your ears as you wander into the office of records. Here, rows of notary-eye professional scribes copy everything by hand. Not just laws, but property deeds, marriage contracts, grain shipments, tax assessments, even imperial gossip sometimes makes it into the margins. These human copy machines work long hours by lamplight, and you can practically feel your eyes drying out just watching them. One notarious, eyes red and fingers cramped, glances up at you with a weak grin. "At least I'm not in the army," he whispers, then returns to transcribing yet another edict. Of course, all these records have to be stored somewhere. You peek into the imperial archives, where towering shelves sag under the weight of scrolls. Dust motes dance in shafts of light, illuminating the chaotic beauty of it all. It's like stepping into a dragon's hoard, but instead of gold, it's hoarded knowledge and red tape. This massive paperwork machine didn't appear overnight. You're standing at the culmination of centuries of administrative evolution. The Romans started it, but Byzantium perfected it. The empire learned early that managing millions of subjects across 3 continents required something more durable than personal charisma or brute force. It required endless obsessive documentation. Even minor events demanded official recognition. Births, marriages, inheritances, all carefully recorded and notarized. Heaven forbid you try to buy land without the proper permits. Failure to follow the rules could mean fines, confiscation, or worse. And yet, as maddening as it is, the system works, at least for now. A small parade of clerks passes you, each holding a different colored ribbon: red for imperial edicts, blue for naval records, green for religious affairs. You raise an eyebrow. Even the ribbons have a hierarchy. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe these color-coded ribbons were a way to help illiterate officials recognize documents at a glance. Pretty clever, if a bit excessive. As you continue, you hear a familiar phrase whispered by one exasperated merchant. "May the saints deliver us from the imperial clerks." You can't help but chuckle. Some things never change. The Byzantine bureaucratic machine is humming, whirring, and rattling all around you. And as we'll see in the next chapter, this machine is about to get a major upgrade, one that will drown the empire in even more scroll signatures, and yes, red tape. You trudge deeper into the empire's administrative web. But now the gears shift backwards, centuries before Constantinople was even Constantinople. You're standing at the feet of a man who didn't exactly invent bureaucracy, but definitely strapped it into a rocket and lit the fuse: Emperor Diocletian. It's the late 3rd century and Rome is collapsing under its own chaotic weight. Plagues, invasions, inflation. Frankly, it's a miracle you're still breathing. Diocletian knows that unless something drastic happens, the empire will shatter into pieces like a poorly fired amphora. His solution: control. Systematic, exhaustive paperwork, heavy control. You watch him scribble at his marbled desk, reorganizing the empire into smaller administrative units called dioceses. Not to be confused with church dioceses, though honestly, everything starts overlapping after a while. Each unit has its own governors, military commanders, and most importantly, tax collectors. Because what's the point of running an empire if you can't fund your soldiers and palaces? The man is practically allergic to loose ends. He creates 4 co-emperors under the tetrarchy system to share power. It's kind of like corporate restructuring, but with more swords and togas. Every law, every edict, every census entry must be logged and tracked. You're seeing the foundations of Byzantine bureaucracy being poured in thick concrete layers upon layers of forms and files. Historians still argue whether Diocletian's reforms saved Rome or simply delayed its inevitable fall. Either way, his passion for administrative control survives long after the Western Empire fades into ruin. The East, soon to become Byzantium, takes these reforms and turns them into an art form. You stroll past a newly built census office where officials question peasants about everything from their land holdings to the number of sheep they own. One nervous farmer stammers 3 sheep and 1 very angry goat. The clerk, without missing a beat, records it in triplicate. Here's your quirky tidbit. Diocletian even tried to freeze prices across the empire with his famous edict on maximum prices. You glance at one of these tablets listing the maximum price of everything from wheat to prostitutes to lions. Yes, lions. Because apparently that was a market. The penalties for violating these price caps: death. So if you ever feel stressed filling out your tax return, just remember at least nobody's threatening to toss you to the lions. Probably. Even currency isn't safe from Diocletian's administrative grip. You watch mint workers strike coins under heavy supervision, each piece meticulously counted and logged. Inflation had ravaged the empire for decades, and Diocletian's reforms attempt to restore stability through rigid accounting. Spoiler alert, they don't fully succeed. You glance up at a large wooden board covered in tiny wax tablets. These contain detailed lists of military supplies, grain weapons, armor saddles, even replacement sandals. The army is vast, scattered across distant frontiers, and feeding it requires meticulous record-keeping. Supply officers nervously tally their inventories, terrified of coming up short when the auditors arrive. One supply officer sighs. Better to lose a battle than lose a shipment. You suspect he might not be entirely joking. The system feeds on itself. More forms require more clerks require more supervisors require entire new buildings to house them. Soon, whole neighborhoods exist solely for paperwork. Byzantium inherits this and triples down. You move forward in time as Constantinople rises from the ashes of Byzantium's forerunner cities. The administrative monster Diocletian created doesn't shrink, it metastasizes. And as you step into the early Byzantine period, you realize that you're not just seeing bureaucracy, you're seeing a culture built on its rituals. Every petition begins with the correct salutation. Every law requires proper phrasing. Even the ink has rules. Imperial purple ink is reserved for the emperor's signature alone. You watch one trembling clerk accidentally dip his pen into purple. The room falls silent. He's whisked away by guards. You decide not to ask what happens next. Now here's a little-known fringe detail. Some records suggest that in certain high offices, officials actually memorized entire legal codes, verbatim, like walking, breathing hard drives. Can you imagine memorizing thousands of statutes just to get promoted? Modern law students eat your heart out. You glance around and see the growing sea of documents stacked on shelves, hanging from ceiling hooks, and filling every available space. Some are bound with string, others with wax seals pressed by signet rings carved with elaborate family crests. But increasingly, more and more documents feature those crimson silk ribbons, the literal red tape. It's becoming a kind of visual shorthand for official business, and sometimes for endless delays. As Diocletian's obsessive systems evolve, Byzantium's bureaucratic DNA becomes clear. Paperwork is not just a tool. It's armor. Armor against rebellion, against fraud, against chaos. If everyone is busy filling out forms, maybe they won't have time to revolt. Clever in a frustrating kind of way. And yet, for all its maddening complexity, you have to admire the ambition. A single city trying to track millions of people across 3 continents with no computers, no phones, no copy machines, just quills, wax ribbons, and the occasional dangerously overloaded donkey. Byzantium's paperwork dragon is now fully awake. And next, you're about to meet the people feeding it, scroll after scroll, the notary. You shuffle now into the next chamber where the air is thick with the faint smell of lamp oil, hot wax, and the overwhelming musk of concentrated human anxiety. Here dwell the notarii, the living engines of Byzantine paperwork. Think of them as human printers, except their ink-stained fingers never get a break, and there's no cheerful ding when they finish a job. You approach a long oak table where rows of scribes are hunched over parchment eyes, narrowed lips, silently mouthing each word as they copy imperial decrees with surgical precision. Quills dance across the surface like frantic insects. Every slip of the pen could mean disaster, or at the very least, an annoyed superior with zero patience for crossed-out mistakes. A young notarius glances up and notices you. He gives a weak smile, gesturing toward his growing mountain of scrolls. 300 copies by sundown. If I finish, I might even get some bread, he whispers, with just enough sarcasm to survive another day. Now here's your historical mainstream fact. The notarii weren't simply copyists. They were highly trained civil servants, educated in law language and imperial protocol. Many came from noble families groomed for these positions because their loyalty and accuracy were critical to the empire's survival. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could disrupt entire provinces. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some notarii developed elaborate shorthand systems called Tyronian notes to speed up their copying. The problem only, they could read their own notes half the time. Entire legal cases occasionally stalled because no one could decipher what the notarius had scribbled 5 years earlier. It's like trying to decode your own grocery list, written while half asleep. As you stand and watch, you notice something odd: wax tablets stacked beside the parchment. Before committing anything to expensive scrolls or vellum drafts were first written on these reusable wax surfaces. One small mistake, just scrape off the wax and start again. It's the ancient equivalent of Ctrl plus Z. Historians still argue whether these scribes were the heroes or the villains of Byzantine bureaucracy. Some claim they kept the empire functioning smoothly. Others believe they created a tangled web of inefficiency that strangled progress. Honestly, it depends on whether you were above or below them in the pecking order. One of the senior notari, a stern man with a pointed beard and eyes like cold steel, reviews a draft before allowing it to be finalized. The emperor's word is law, he mutters. We do not simply write. We preserve the will of the divine. And there it is, the religious undertone. In Byzantium, the emperor isn't just a ruler, he's God's representative on earth. Copying his words is practically a sacred duty. The room suddenly goes quiet as a courier bursts in panting. An imperial addendum, he cries, holding a small scroll wrapped, of course, in red tape. The senior notarius opens it, reads quickly, and sighs. Amend paragraph 4, line 12, effective immediately. Without missing a beat, the scribes begin altering their copies, carefully inserting the new wording while maintaining perfect formatting. It's like watching a school of fish change direction midstream. But this perfection has its cost. Promotions among notarii aren't given for creativity, but for obedience, accuracy, and endurance. After years of loyal service, some rise to become Magister Officiorum, Master of Offices, a position wielding incredible influence over the entire bureaucracy. Others simply burn out their eyesight, ruin their hands permanently cramped. You take a moment to glance at the walls. Shelves groan under the weight of scrolls categorized with obsessive precision tax rolls, legal codes, property deeds, trade licenses, military requisitions. Each scroll has its assigned place, its unique label, and more often than not, its accompanying colored ribbon. Now, for the fringe debate. Some scholars theorize that these archives grew so vast that certain records became permanently lost, not because they were destroyed, but because no one could physically find them anymore. In a bizarre way, the paperwork protected itself through sheer volume, a kind of bureaucratic camouflage. Walking through these endless aisles of information, you feel a strange mix of awe and claustrophobia. This isn't just administration, it's obsession. The Byzantines weren't content to rule. They wanted to document every breath, every transaction, every word uttered within their domain. If power is knowledge, then this empire is absolutely swimming in it. One clerk stumbles past you, his arms overloaded with scrolls destined for various ministries. You hear him mumble, "If only the saints would invent shelves with wheels." You nod sympathetically. Bureaucratic logistics haven't changed much, have they? In this world, the notarii are both gatekeepers and bottlenecks. Their work allows governors to govern armies to march and taxes to flow. Yet their power is also dangerous. A misplaced document or deliberate delay could ruin careers, incite rebellions, or occasionally decide wars. The emperor may sit on the throne, but these ink-stained clerks are the tiny gears keeping the imperial machine from collapsing, at least for now. You continue forward deeper into the ever-expanding maze of forms, seals, and crimson ribbons. Ahead, another layer of Byzantine bureaucracy awaits you, and with it, the curious birth of a literal symbol for this paper-choked world, the red tape itself. You shuffle through yet another arched hallway, your sandals sticking slightly to the polished stone, as you enter a smaller, but somehow even more suffocating office. Here is where you witness the birth of something oddly familiar, something that centuries later will become the modern world's favorite metaphor for bureaucratic misery: red tape. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Before you is a long wooden counter stacked high with scrolls bound, not by leather or rope, but by thin silk ribbons, each a deep, unmistakable shade of crimson. The wax seals glisten faintly in the flickering lamplight, bearing intricate imperial insignias pressed from personalized signet rings. If Byzantium had a scent, it would be warm beeswax ink and anxious sweat. A low-ranking official shuffles toward you, arms full of documents, awaiting authorization. If you want it done quickly, he mutters with a grin, better bring wine. Good wine. You can't tell if he's joking. You hope he is. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Byzantines actually invented the practice of binding important documents with red-dyed silk ribbons secured with wax seals to signify their official status. The richer the dye, the higher the authority. Red silk was reserved for imperial business. Mere mortals used other colors, if they were allowed ribbons at all. The practice was as much psychological as it was administrative. If a scroll wore red silk, it screamed importance. Only the emperor, his closest ministers, or top church officials dealt in red tape. It was a visual shortcut, an ancient color-coded traffic signal that shouted, "Don't lose this, or you'll lose your head." Now for your quirky tidbit. Silk was so valuable that some unscrupulous clerks would secretly cut slivers off the ribbons to sell on the black market. Yes, people literally stole red tape from bureaucratic archives to make a quick coin. The Byzantine Empire, where even office supplies became a side hustle. Historians still argue whether the origin of the phrase red tape comes exclusively from Byzantium, or whether it evolved as other European bureaucracies borrowed and twisted the practice later. What's generally agreed upon is that Byzantium was one of the first civilizations to turn colored binding into an actual administrative protocol. As you watch, one young clerk delicately wraps a scroll in crimson silk before heating a small brass spoon filled with sealing wax over a flame. He carefully drips the molten wax onto the knot and presses it with a carved signet ring. The result, a bright, glossy seal bearing the double-headed eagle, the imperial symbol of the Eastern Roman Empire. Beautiful, isn't it? The clerk says, proudly admiring his handiwork. One mistake, though, and the exactor will have my fingers. You slowly tuck your own fingers behind your back. The purpose of this elaborate ritual was more than just visual flair. These seals functioned like today's multi-factor authentication. A broken seal meant tampering. An incorrect ribbon color, unauthorized jurisdiction. The smallest detail out of place could nullify an entire legal proceeding or worse, implicate someone in forgery. You glance at a line of nervous petitioners standing nearby, each clutching tightly to their carefully bound documents. Farmers seeking tax relief, merchants requesting trade licenses, soldiers petitioning for back pay. Every one of them knows, without the right ribbon and seal, their petition may as well not exist. And here's where it gets wild. Byzantium's obsession with protocol extended even to the physical handling of documents. Some officials were forbidden from personally touching imperial edicts. Instead, special gloved attendants wearing soft linen gloves no less presented the sealed scrolls to prevent any human contamination of the emperor's word. You try not to laugh, but honestly, you fail a little. The logic was both practical and deeply symbolic. The emperor's decree was sacred. Touching it improperly risked not just administrative error, but borderline blasphemy. After all, the emperor was God's chosen vessel. His words sealed in red silk and wax were almost divine scripture. You move to another chamber where scrolls are stored in neat wooden cubbies, each labeled with ivory plaques, engraved with the names of different administrative departments, tax offices, military registries, religious councils, naval records, census rolls. The red-taped scrolls gleam like polished rubies scattered through this forest of parchment. Another quirky corner of this world. There were literal job titles for ribbon handlers. Yes, silk masters managed inventory of the precious dyed threads. They oversaw the procurement, dyeing, cutting, and distribution of silk ribbons for official use. Lose track of even a few meters of silk, and you might answer to more than just your supervisor. Silk theft was investigated with the same seriousness as embezzlement. A senior administrator steps into view now. A logothete, one of the high-ranking financial officers responsible for managing entire departments of the imperial bureaucracy. His robes shimmer faintly with gold thread embroidery, signaling his elevated rank. As he inspects the sealed scrolls, he smiles at you politely, but says nothing. His power is unspoken, but palpable. The man doesn't need to bark orders. The crimson ribbons do it for him. Historians still puzzle over how much of this system was designed for efficiency versus psychological control. Was it about safeguarding documents or safeguarding power? After all, in a world where literacy was rare, visual symbols like red tape created instant hierarchies anyone could recognize. The scroll itself might be unreadable to most, but the color that spoke volumes. You leave the chamber now, the vivid crimson burned into your mind. Byzantium's love affair with administrative ritual is growing more intricate by the hour. And as you'll soon discover, even getting those precious ribbons and seals wasn't the end. And it was often just the beginning. Because next comes the infuriating, sometimes maddening chase for signatures. You follow the next winding corridor, passing nervous clerks and exasperated petitioners, until you arrive at what feels like the Byzantine equivalent of an obstacle course, the signature chase. If you thought getting your hands on red tape was complicated, wait until you see what it takes to collect all the necessary signatures. Before you is a long, crowded hallway lined with benches. Every seat is occupied by people clutching their scrolls, anxiously watching for their name to be called. The air is thick with murmurs, frustrated sighs, and the occasional whispered prayer. You can almost hear the collective heartbeat of a city locked in an eternal waiting game. A harried merchant leans over to you and mutters, "I've been waiting 4 days for the eparch's signature." After that, it's the Magister Officiorum, and then the Logothete tu Dromu. If I'm lucky, I'll be finished before Pentecost. You offer a sympathetic nod. Privately, you doubt it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Byzantium's administrative hierarchy required multiple layers of authorization for almost every official transaction. Land sales tax adjustments, military appointments, and business licenses all needed a precise chain of approvals. Missing one signature could nullify an entire transaction. And now, your quirky tidbit. In some cases, the order of signatures wasn't just bureaucratic protocol. It was politically charged. Certain powerful officials refused to sign a document unless their signature appeared above a rival's. Petty office politics in ancient silk robes. You can't help but smirk at how painfully familiar that sounds. Historians still argue whether this signature layering was a deliberate tool of imperial control or simply an organic byproduct of an overcomplicated system that no one had the courage or authority to streamline. One theory suggests the Byzantine court even encouraged these logjams, believing that by forcing officials to work together, they'd keep each other's ambitions in check. You watch as a frazzled farmer approaches a counter manned by a low-level clerk. The farmer's parchment, wrapped in modest blue ribbon, is unfurled with exaggerated care. The clerk inspects the existing seals and signatures, nods grimly, and stamps it with his own wax mark before directing the poor man to the next chamber. There's always a next chamber, the clerk says to you dryly, as if reading your thoughts. You step into one of these next chambers where a senior administrator, a Magister Scrinorum, reviews documents presented by trembling petitioners. His table is cluttered with ink pots, scroll knives, and spare signet rings. Behind him, a wall of locked cabinets holds ribbons of every authorized color, each measured and logged like precious gems. "State your business," he says without looking up. A young naval officer approaches and presents a request for additional ship rations. The official skims it, pauses, and sighs. The Praetorian prefect must initial this first, then return. The officer bows and retreats, his shoulders slumped under the weight of bureaucracy, heavier than any shield. Here's where the system reveals its darker side. These officials aren't just gatekeepers. They are toll booths. Bribes called charistikea or dora often grease the wheels. Some officials were notorious for inventing new signatures or approvals just to extract more gifts. A bottle of imported wine here, a pouch of coins there, it was a silent, grudgingly accepted part of the Byzantine experience. You overhear one petitioner whispering to another, "A little oil makes the gears turn smoother." The second nods grimly, slipping a small coin pouch beneath his sleeve. Of course, getting signatures also meant navigating an ever-changing network of imperial politics. A signature today might carry weight, but tomorrow, if the official falls out of favor, all their approvals could be revoked. Careers, fortunes, even lives could unravel because a single signature lost its value overnight. And here's your fringe debate. Some scholars believe that these endless layers of authorization actually functioned as an early form of internal audit. By forcing multiple people to review each transaction, the empire created a built-in system of cross-checks, inefficient, yes, but surprisingly effective at exposing fraud, at least sometimes. You step into yet another hall and find yourself face to face with the ultimate boss in this bureaucratic game, the Magister Officiorum, the Master of Offices. His position controls the entire civil service apparatus. Spies, couriers, provincial governors, and countless departments all report up to him. His signature is often the final one needed before any petition reaches the emperor himself. Unlike the bustling lower offices, his chamber is eerily quiet. 2 guards flank his desk. He reviews each scroll with agonizing slowness, occasionally raising an eyebrow, before affixing his personal seal, a unique imprint reserved solely for his office. His power isn't in what he signs, it's in what he chooses not to sign. The weight of every scroll that crosses his desk feels monumental. Each represents weeks, sometimes months, of someone else's exhausting pilgrimage through Byzantine red tape. You leave the chamber, head spinning slightly from the sheer complexity of it all. What strikes you most isn't just the paperwork. It's the layers of personal ambition, rivalry, and quiet desperation woven into every stage. The empire didn't merely build a bureaucracy. It built a machine powered by human nature itself. And next, you're about to meet the very people who turned that machine into their private empire, the professional bureaucratic class, the empire's new nobility. You continue your trek through this administrative jungle, stepping now into the beating heart of Byzantium's real power, the bureaucratic elite. These aren't warriors, generals, or priests. These are the men who mastered the true weapon of the empire paperwork. You find yourself in a marble courtyard, buzzing with well-dressed officials. Their silk robes shimmer faintly in the sunlight, embroidered with intricate patterns that announce their rank and department. Some wear tiny gold pins shaped like scrolls. Others bear rings engraved with their office insignia. The quiet murmuring around you is punctuated by the scratch of scribes taking notes on tablets, the soft clinking of coins changing hands, and the occasional suppressed chuckle over some poor petitioner's latest delay. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 10th century, Byzantine bureaucracy had evolved into a rigid caste of career officials. These were not aristocrats by birth, but men who earned their influence through loyalty, intelligence, and of course, an almost supernatural tolerance for paperwork. Many came from educated families, but lacked land or military clout. Bureaucracy was their ticket to power, and here's your quirky tidbit. Some ambitious parents actually raised their sons from childhood to master imperial protocols, administrative law, and even the Byzantine art of polite flattery, essential skills for climbing the bureaucratic ladder. Picture it, children practicing how to address a superior properly while other kids are playing with toy swords. Historians still argue whether this rising class of bureaucrats strengthened the empire or slowly choked it. On one hand, they provided continuity, stability, and detailed governance. On the other, they created layers of resistance to reform and often prioritized their personal advancement over the empire's needs. You watch as one particularly smug official, a logothete, strides through the courtyard. The logothetes were like cabinet ministers, each controlling a key slice of the empire. Finance, the military, foreign affairs, postal routes, even the imperial household. Their influence rivaled that of the emperor's closest advisors. One lesser clerk whispers to you, "That's logothete Nicetas." They say even generals bow lower to him than to the patriarch. You glance as Nikitas pauses, his silk robes barely rustling, as subordinates scurry to present him with fresh scrolls. The bureaucracy had its own language too thick with euphemisms and polite legalese. Instead of saying, "Your petition is rejected," an official might write, "The matter requires further reflection in accordance with divine wisdom." Translation: no. But you may wait another year. You overhear a minor official coaching a newcomer never say yes. Say, "Subject to further deliberation." Always leave room for negotiation. You're pretty sure that exact phrase still gets used in modern boardrooms, but with power came risk. A bureaucrat's position depended entirely on imperial favor. One wrong political move, one forged signature discovered, and years of careful service could vanish overnight. Prison or exile was never far away. You pass by a scribe muttering nervously while reviewing a list of charges against a disgraced logothete. Misappropriation of silk quotas, misreporting tax levies, unauthorized promotions. The charges go on like a depressing shopping list, and yet despite the dangers, the allure of bureaucracy remained irresistible. Positions offered not only salaries, but access to lucrative patronage networks. High-ranking officials controlled who received contracts, who got tax exemptions, who was fast-tracked through administrative purgatory. Everyone owed someone a favor. Now for the fringe debate. Some modern scholars believe the Byzantine bureaucratic class laid the groundwork for Europe's later civil service models. The idea of a professional, educated administrative elite separate from the nobility or clergy emerged here first, long before it spread westward. You pass into a long hall filled with smaller offices where junior officials draft legal decisions and financial reports. One clerk pauses to adjust his carefully measured stack of wax tablets. Precision is everything he says proudly. A crooked tally today becomes a rebellion tomorrow. You nod, recognizing the perverse beauty of this system. By mastering procedure, these bureaucrats insulated themselves from both military coups and populist revolts. As long as the scrolls kept moving and the red tape kept binding, the empire could survive nearly anything. Even the emperor himself wasn't always free from their influence. You hear whispers of previous rulers who found themselves subtly blocked or delayed by their own administrators, not through open defiance, but through endless procedural delays. A missing signature, an outdated permit, a requirement for further investigation. The bureaucracy could move at lightning speed when it wished, or grind to an agonizing crawl when it didn't. And here's where the genius of it all clicks into place. The bureaucracy served not only to govern, but to balance power. No single military general, religious leader, or noble could easily seize total control. The bureaucratic web wrapped around everyone, even the throne, like silk threads holding the empire together. You step back into the courtyard, watching as a fresh scroll wrapped in red tape is carried reverently toward the palace. The sun gleams off its wax seal, casting a ruby glow across the marble floor. And yet you know that beneath this polished surface lies a darker, sharper edge, one that cuts deeply into everyday Byzantine life. Because while the bureaucrats thrived in their red tape empire, the tax collectors were about to turn that same web into a financial noose for ordinary citizens. You step away from the polished courtyards of silk-robed officials and enter a far more secretive chamber of Byzantine power, one where ambition and eunuchs ruled side by side. Yes, eunuchs, the empire's most unlikely but astonishingly effective bureaucratic elite. As the doors creak open, you find yourself surrounded by men with smooth faces, soft voices, and calm but calculating eyes. Unlike the other officials you've seen, these men have no families, no heirs, no bloodlines to promote, only their service to the empire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Byzantine eunuchs were some of the most trusted administrators in the empire. Because they couldn't establish dynasties or produce rival heirs, emperors found them less threatening. Many rose to occupy some of the highest positions in the court, including chamberlains, treasurers, and even military commanders. Your quirky tidbit. Some families would voluntarily castrate young boys and offer them to the imperial service, gambling that the sacrifice would bring wealth and privilege far beyond what a normal career might provide. A grotesque investment, but one that sometimes paid off spectacularly. Historians still debate whether this practice was born more out of imperial paranoia or administrative pragmatism. On one hand, eunuchs offered unmatched loyalty to the throne. On the other, their existence highlights just how deeply the empire mistrusted its own aristocracy. You watch one of these high-ranking eunuchs glide across the room, the praepositus sacri cubiculi, or Grand Chamberlain, one of the most powerful figures in Byzantium. His silken robes sparkle with purple trim, a color reserved only for the emperor and his closest confidants. His authority is enormous. He controls access to the emperor's private chambers. Anyone wishing to petition the emperor must pass through him first. It's said that sometimes even the emperor's own family had to request an audience through these men. A junior official whispers as the Grand Chamberlain passes. He who controls the door controls the throne. You can't help but nod. Access equals power, and no one controlled access like the eunuchs. But their power wasn't limited to the palace corridors. Many eunuchs managed vast sections of the imperial administration, overseeing tax revenues, diplomatic correspondence, church affairs, and even military logistics. Their neutrality, at least in theory, made them perfect arbiters between feuding generals and jealous nobles. You pass by a eunuch scribe reviewing foreign envoys' tribute lists. His delicate fingers slide over golden coins, bolts of silk, and exotic animals cataloged in perfect columns. A leopard from Nubia, 300 bushels of Egyptian wheat, 12 barrels of Chian wine, he murmurs softly. Each item neatly logged, sealed, and naturally bound with the correct colored ribbon. Here's a fringe detail for you. Some eunuchs even led armies into battle commanding legions, despite the empire's traditional suspicion of placing non-military men in combat roles. One famous example, the Narcissus defeated the Ostrogoths at the age of 70, proving that sharp minds often outlast sharp swords. And yet, for all their power, eunuchs walked a dangerous tightrope. If they fell out of favor, and many eventually did, their downfall was swift. Stripped of office, wealth, and influence, they could be exiled or imprisoned. You pass a darkened corner of the palace, where disgraced former officials once languished, the silence heavy with forgotten ambitions. You overhear two junior eunuchs whispering. Did you hear the Chamberlain replaced 2 secretaries last week? No warning. Gone. The second shivers. That's why we serve quietly. No friends. No enemies. Historians continue to argue whether eunuchs' dominance reflected Byzantium's genius or its fatal insecurity. Were they efficient servants of state stability or living symbols of how paranoia warped imperial governance? Either way, they became an indispensable part of the Byzantine machine. What strikes you most isn't just their power, it's how seamlessly they adapted to every imperial whim. New emperor, new policies, shifting alliances. The eunuchs glided between them, all their power quietly intact. You exit the chamber, your mind swirling with the strange mixture of sacrifice ambition and cold calculation that built this unique class of administrators. But as you step outside into the busy streets, another layer of Byzantine bureaucracy asserts itself, one far less elegant, far more painful, the monstrous, ever-changing world of taxation. You step now into the streets of Constantinople, where the Byzantine Empire's true sport takes place. Not chariot races, not gladiator battles, but taxation. If paperwork is the lifeblood of the bureaucracy, taxes are its beating heart, pumping coins into every marble hall and silk-lined chamber you've seen so far. The morning sun glints off shop stalls, grain carts, and merchant boats along the Golden Horn. Yet behind every transaction, you sense an invisible presence, the tax collectors. Always watching, always calculating. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Byzantine tax system was staggeringly complex. Taxes were assessed not only on land, but on professions, trade imports, livestock inheritance, and even personal status. If it moved, grew, or earned money, the empire wanted its cut. Tax codes weren't fixed. They changed constantly to fit imperial needs and shifting military campaigns. And your quirky tidbit, there was even a tax on beehives. Yes, beehives. The empire quite literally squeezed honey from every corner of daily life. You approach a public square where nervous citizens stand before tax assessors seated behind tall, polished desks. Each assessor consults an array of scrolls listing property surveys known as practica. A man protests, "But I only own 2 goats this year, not 3. The assessor barely looks up. Last year's count was 3. Pay for 3. Historians still argue whether this system's complexity was by design or accident. Some suggest the empire intentionally kept tax laws bewildering to limit resistance and ensure that only the most loyal and best connected could navigate them successfully. Others see it as administrative creep, layer upon layer, added as new crises arose. You step inside one of the nearby offices where a tax official scribbles notes into a leather-bound ledger. The census says 6 fields. The tithe requires 1/10. The military levy adds 2% for defense. His voice drones like a merchant reading a shopping list, but the weight behind his words is crushing. For the average Byzantine peasant or merchant, taxes could consume 1/3 or even half of their annual income. Failure to pay could mean property seizure, imprisonment, or exile. And while tax relief existed, it required surprise, yet more petition signatures and red tape. You watch as one desperate farmer kneels presenting his carefully wrapped appeal scroll. The official eyes it skeptically. "Do you have the bishop's endorsement?" The farmer shakes his head. The official sighs. "Then you'll wait." Of course, exemptions were available for the right people. Monasteries often negotiated favorable rates or outright exemptions, claiming spiritual service in exchange for financial relief. Military officers were sometimes rewarded with tax breaks. Wealthy urban elites found ways to shield income through legal loopholes or, more often, well-placed bribes. You hear 2 merchants whispering over wine cups. If you pay the inspector directly, the sheep tax might disappear. The other chuckles bitterly, unless his superior finds out and demands double. This leads us to one of Byzantium's most delicate balancing acts, tax farming. Officials were sometimes allowed to collect taxes themselves, forwarding a fixed amount to the state and keeping any surplus. In theory, this motivated efficient collection. In practice, it bred corruption like spoiled wine breeds flies. You peer into a dark corner where tax farmers argue heatedly over territory. This district's mine now. The Praetorian prefect signed it over. Your document's 3 months old. I have a newer seal. The dispute quickly spirals into a battle of wax seals and signature hierarchies, a bureaucratic sword fight without actual swords. Here's your fringe debate. Some modern economists actually credit Byzantium's intricate tax system for its longevity. By constantly adapting rates and methods, the empire remained financially solvent far longer than its Western counterpart. Yet others argue this very complexity bred resentment that later fueled revolts. You walk past one of the empire's dreaded tax prisons, a modest stone building that hides enormous misery behind its simple walls. Inside, debtors languish, while desperate relatives scramble to gather funds or negotiate leniency through further petitions and inevitably more signatures. Outside, a group of artisans debates whether to form a guild, an officially recognized trade association that would offer legal protections but also lock them into a lifetime of collective tax obligations. "Better the emperor's yoke than the tax collector's whip," one murmurs. His friend replies, "That depends entirely on the whip." You can't help but marvel through gritted teeth at how deeply tax collection is woven into every layer of Byzantine life. It funds armies, palaces, and cathedrals, but it also fuels bribes, fuels resentment, and fuels the bureaucracy itself, feeding back into the endless loops of red tape you've been trudging through. As you leave the market square, you glance back at a long line of petitioners snaking toward the tax office, each clutching scrolls tied with colored ribbons, each hoping their plea might win some small mercy from the administrative machine. But just as taxes provided one face of the Byzantine bureaucracy, another far more secretive face lurked beneath one of spies' informants and political games played behind closed doors. And that's where you're headed next. You slip now into the quiet shadows behind Byzantium's glittering marble facades. The bustling courtyards, the tax offices, even the endless paperwork, they're only part of the empire's story. Beneath it all hums something far more unsettling, the empire's tangled web of spies, secretaries, and double agents. As you step into a dim hallway deep within the imperial palace, the air feels heavier, as though the very walls are listening. And in a way they are. Because in Byzantium, information isn't just valuable, it's everything. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Byzantine Empire developed one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the medieval world, the Bureau of Barbarians. Yes, that's its actual name. Handled foreign intelligence, monitored ambassadors, and gathered reports from far-flung provinces. But it didn't stop there. Domestic surveillance was just as important. Your quirky tidbit. Even palace servants were sometimes recruited as informants. Who better to eavesdrop on powerful ministers than the people pouring their wine or sweeping their chambers? Your maid might fluff your pillows one day and report your private conversations to imperial officials the next. Historians still argue whether this pervasive spying helped stabilize the empire or simply fueled its legendary paranoia. On one hand, the constant flow of information allowed emperors to preempt conspiracies. On the other, it created a culture where trust was scarce and betrayal was routine. You watch as a scribe in the corner carefully transcribes intercepted correspondence onto a wax tablet. He pauses occasionally, frowning as he deciphers the coded messages sent between distant governors. Governor Theodolos speaks too warmly of his troops, he mutters. Potential loyalty issue. These scribes serve the logothete tu dromou, the master of posts and communications. Officially, he controls couriers and trade routes. Unofficially, he runs much of the empire's surveillance state. Every message carried by state couriers might be opened, copied, and resealed before reaching its destination. Privacy is frankly a myth. You slip further inside and find a chamber where secretaries sort piles of reports, troop movements, market fluctuations, whispers of heresy, rumors of bribery, even the private scandals of aristocrats. Each scroll wrapped, of course, in carefully color-coded ribbons. One official glances at you with a thin smile. News is our business. News is control. He returns to sorting files labeled with names that likely represent both foreign kings and domestic rivals. Here's where things get particularly Byzantine, pun fully intended. Informants often reported on each other. The system nested layers upon layers of watchers watching the watchers. A general might have his correspondence intercepted by imperial agents, while his own staff secretly reported his behavior back to rival ministers in Constantinople. It's enough to make your head spin. You pass two junior officials whispering nervously. Do you think the Magister Officiorum trusts the new logothete, one asks. The other shrugs. Trust he has 3 agents following him. That's trust in Byzantium. And yet this system, equal parts brilliance and madness, allowed the empire to maintain extraordinary stability across centuries. Conspiracies still happened, of course, but many were discovered before they ever matured into real threats. Competitors often self-destructed before they could rise too high, tangled in the very web they helped spin. Now for your fringe debate. Some modern scholars suggest that Byzantine intelligence operations rivaled those of Cold War superpowers in sophistication. The difference: the Byzantines did it all, without electricity, telegraphs, or even typewriters. Just couriers' whispers and an astonishing capacity for written record-keeping. You observe a scene where a foreign ambassador presents his credentials to an imperial chamberlain. What neither knows but both suspect is that their entire meeting is being recorded in secret. Behind a thin curtain, a scribe writes furiously, capturing every word for imperial review later. In Byzantium, diplomacy is always a performance, often staged for unseen audiences. Even the church isn't immune. You pass through a side chamber where reports on theological dissent are compiled for the patriarch and emperor alike. Bishop Philotheos has been speaking too boldly, one clerk notes with a raised eyebrow. Possible Nestorian sympathies. Another nods. We'll add it to the file. But for all its efficiency, this climate of suspicion takes its toll. You overhear a weary merchant sighing to his friend. Keep your prayers silent and your opinions quieter. The friend nods, eyes darting toward the nearest servant. Walls have ears after all. You emerge now into the bright courtyard again, but the air feels different. You can almost feel the invisible weight of the Empire's paranoia pressing down on everyone, even yourself. And yet, even this intricate web of spies and informants is but one strand in Byzantium's paperwork jungle. For the most enduring legacy of Byzantine bureaucracy wasn't simply surveillance, but the ever-growing mountain of laws that governed everything from church doctrine to fish market prices. That's where you head next. You walk now into what feels like a temple, but instead of statues or incense, the towering shelves are lined with scrolls. Endless scrolls. This is the legal core of Byzantium, where red tape becomes not just ribbons, but entire forests of law. And at the center of this dizzying maze stands one towering figure, Emperor Justinian. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the 6th century, Justinian ordered a massive codification of Roman law, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It would become one of the most influential legal collections in world history, shaping European law for centuries after Byzantium itself crumbled. You run your fingers gently along one of the hefty scrolls. It's staggering. The corpus didn't just simplify laws. It consolidated centuries of contradictory statutes, imperial edicts, legal commentaries, and court precedents into a single organized framework. Finally, clarity, or so Justinian hoped. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some sections of the code include bizarre leftovers from earlier laws, like regulations on how to legally free your favorite dancing bear, or detailed instructions on how to handle disputes involving wandering acrobats. Apparently, Byzantine lawmakers prepared for everything. Historians still argue whether Justinian's legal reform actually simplified Byzantine life, or simply reorganized its existing complications into fancier packaging. For the average citizen, the law remained dense, often inaccessible, and still required a small army of lawyers, clerks, and judges to interpret. You watch as a junior lawyer presents a land dispute case before a magistrate. Both sides arrive, carrying bundles of scrolls tied in different ribbon colors, representing tax assessments, previous rulings, witness testimonies, and imperial decrees. It looks more like an archival wrestling match than a legal proceeding. The magistrate, a silver-bearded man with an exhausted expression, sighs as he untangles the scrolls. We will need 3 days simply to review the applicable codes. You can't help but pity both the litigants and the overworked magistrate. Legal professionals thrive in this system. Law schools known as scholae juris train new generations of scribes and advocates to navigate the legal labyrinth. These students spend years memorizing imperial edicts, church canons, and even legal commentaries written by previous generations of scholars, much like modern law students drowning in casebooks. You overhear a group of students reciting obscure statutes. Property boundaries may not be altered without notification of the ecdicos, unless such boundaries fall under the jurisdiction of a deceased patrician's disputed estate. One student groans, "Who writes this stuff?" Another whispers, "Men who get paid by the scroll." But it's not just property law clogging the system. The Byzantine legal world governs marriage contracts, trade regulations, inheritance disputes, religious orthodoxy, military discipline, and even food safety. You pass a stack of rulings addressing issues as granular as how many loaves of bread a bakery may produce without triggering a grain inspection. And here's where things get properly Byzantine. Every major legal decision spawns layers of sub-rulings, interpretations, and clarifications. The law does not shrink, it only grows. Each imperial reign adds new edicts, while carefully avoiding the politically dangerous task of repealing previous ones. After all, repealing your predecessor's law might suggest they made a mistake. In Byzantium, no emperor makes mistakes, they merely supplement what came before. You pause at an alcove where a small team of clerks reviews marriage petitions. Byzantine marriage law is its own mini labyrinth. You hear one clerk mutter, "The dowry's value must be certified by both families. Relatives within the 7th degree are prohibited." Unless, of course, there's a special dispensation. A farmer's daughter and a minor official stand nervously nearby, awaiting judgment on whether their intended union violates one of the dozens of family relationship statutes. The clerk sighs deeply. "We will consult the patriarch's office." And just like that, their wedding is delayed another several weeks. Here's a fringe debate for you. Some modern legal theorists admire Byzantine law for its surprising flexibility. Instead of rigid legal codes, many decisions left wide discretion to judges and administrators, allowing case-by-case resolutions. But others see this as an invitation to abuse, where outcomes depended more on bribes, connections, and who interpreted the ever-growing mountain of laws. And naturally, every decision, ruling, and appeal gets documented, written, sealed, stored, and eventually forgotten in one of the empire's ever-expanding archives. You peek into one dim storage vault, where old rulings are stacked like forgotten tombstones, bound with ribbons so faded that even their original colors are lost. A clerk chuckles as he closes the heavy door behind you. Some of these haven't been read in 100 years, but they still exist, just in case. You step back into the sunlight, your head swimming from the sheer weight of legal minutia. And yet you know that even these countless scrolls were not enough to keep everything orderly. Because wherever rules exist, loopholes follow. And where loopholes exist, corruption flourishes. Which means, of course, you're headed straight for Byzantium's most creative sport, bribery. You step now into the smoky back rooms of Byzantine bureaucracy, where the real art of survival takes place. Here, laws are flexible. Signatures are negotiable, and outcomes often depend less on scrolls and more on gifts. Welcome to the vibrant, infuriating, and strangely creative world of Byzantine corruption. The first thing you notice, the whispers. They float like incense, cautious, calculated, and constant. A small favor for the exactor, a token of gratitude for the logothete, an expression of respect for the clerk's hard work. No one dares say the word bribe out loud, but everyone knows exactly what's being offered. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Corruption was so deeply embedded in Byzantine bureaucracy that emperors often issued laws banning it, while their own officials ignored those very laws the next morning. Bribery was illegal on paper, but practically expected in practice. And your quirky tidbit. There was even an unofficial price list for common services. Need your case reviewed faster? That'll cost 1 gold nomisma. Want a tax audit to overlook a few missing goats? 3 nomismata. Secure a prestigious office. Now you're negotiating serious sums, plus promises of loyalty and future favors. Historians still debate whether Byzantine corruption was a fatal flaw or a weirdly functional lubricant. Some argue it kept the gears turning, smoothing rigid systems through unofficial flexibility. Others say it weakened the empire's integrity, hollowing it from within. As usual in Byzantium, both views probably hold some truth. You watch as a harried merchant approaches a customs officer at the bustling docks. His paperwork is immaculate, tied in proper ribbons, but the officer frowns and mutters, "Unusual cargo requires additional verification." The merchant sighs discreetly, slipping a small pouch across the desk. The officer nods approvingly. Verification complete. This scene plays out everywhere. Markets, courts, tax offices, even church appointments. A high-ranking eunuch once quipped, "Without gifts, even angels would be delayed at heaven's gates." You're not entirely sure he was joking. Byzantine officials became masters of inventing new fees and procedural hurdles to justify these negotiations. One clever tax assessor devised multiple subcategories for vineyard taxes based on grape color fermentation method and even barrel size, all of which created wonderful new opportunities for small, quiet payments to make problems vanish. You pass a notary office where two junior scribes argue over who gets to process a lucrative merchant petition. "He already promised me a contribution for the orphans fund," one says with a wink. The other snorts, "Orphans, sure. Your wine cellar will be grateful." At higher levels, these informal payments became massive patronage networks. Bureaucrats exchanged favors across departments, a tax break here, a military promotion there, a well-timed marriage arranged for someone's nephew. Entire careers were built or destroyed on webs of these invisible debts. Here's a fringe debate. Some scholars argue that Byzantine corruption was surprisingly meritocratic. Bribes might open doors, but incompetent officials were still eventually exposed, often because rivals leaked damaging reports to imperial auditors. In that sense, corruption served as a strange form of self-regulating balance. The incompetent were eaten alive. The shrewd survived. You overhear a pair of mid-level officials trading stories. "The logothete of the drome received a peacock from Persia last week," one says. A live peacock, mind you. The other chuckles. "Peacocks are fashionable now. 2 months ago it was fine silk. Next month, probably monkeys." But bribery wasn't always about coins or exotic gifts. Influence itself was currency, patronage, protection, insider knowledge. Sometimes the most valuable thing an official could offer was simply access and introduction to someone higher up the ladder. You pass through a private chamber where a wealthy merchant is quietly negotiating with a logothete's aide. No money changes hands, yet only promises whispered under the guise of polite conversation. If your superior were to support my request, the merchant offers certain trade opportunities in Alexandria might be arranged. Exclusive contracts, you understand. The aide smiles faintly. Of course, the empire thrives on cooperation. You can't help but marvel at the twisted elegance of it all. The Byzantine bureaucracy wasn't paralyzed by corruption, it danced with it. Like a careful negotiation with the divine, everyone understood the rules, even if they pretended not to. And yet, beneath this oily surface, danger always lurked. One misstep, one bribe exposed at the wrong moment, and entire networks could unravel overnight. An emperor could purge whole ministries with a single decree, both as punishment and as a convenient political reset. You hear distant rumors as you walk: an exactor dismissed for embezzlement, a praetorian prefect arrested for accounting irregularities, their replacements already lobbying for the same offices, armed with fresh gifts and better allies. As you leave the chamber of whispered deals, you realize how fully the Byzantine system transformed law into theater procedure, into negotiation, and power into a marketplace. And yet, even for ordinary citizens trying simply to live their lives, this world of bribes and favors made everything from planting crops to marrying children a gauntlet of paperwork and persuasion. Which brings you to your next stop, the common people trapped beneath all this silk, wax, and ribbon. Because while the bureaucrats played their games, the peasants waded through the paperwork swamp, one petition at a time. You leave behind the polished halls of logothetes and grand chamberlains, stepping now into the dustier, harsher world of the Byzantine everyman, the farmer, the shopkeeper, The merchant, the fisherman, the people who kept the empire running while desperately trying not to drown in its endless sea of paperwork. The first thing you notice, the scrolls. They're everywhere. Sticking out of coat sleeves, bundled in baskets, strapped to donkey saddles, even tucked behind market stalls like secret weapons. Because in Byzantium, even the simplest act of daily life requires official documentation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. For most Byzantines' basic aspects of life, marriage, property, ownership, farming rights, market stalls, fishing permits, guild memberships, all required official licenses. Without paperwork, your existence was practically illegal. You watch as a poor farmer approaches a local clerk with a weary expression, clutching a small scroll tied in plain twine. He can't afford the finer ribbons. "I seek permission to marry my neighbor's daughter," he says quietly. The clerk frowns, glancing at his ledger. "Has the dowry been recorded? Are both families free from debt? Has the bishop approved the union?" The farmer sighs. "Not yet." The clerk shrugs. "Return when they are." Your quirky tidbit, even births and deaths required registration and, of course, fees. Without official records, children might not inherit property, and widows could lose legal protection. In some provinces, desperate families hired professional petitioners who specialized in navigating the paperwork for a fee. Yes, full-time Byzantine fixers. Historians still debate whether this web of regulation protected citizens or exploited them. Some argue it offered legal protections unknown in many medieval societies. Others see it as an elaborate trap that funneled money and power toward the bureaucracy. You wander into a bustling marketplace where vendors loudly advertise their wares: olive oil, pottery silk, and salted fish. But behind every transaction lurks an inspector checking licenses and measuring scales. A merchant curses under his breath as an inspector jots notes onto a wax tablet. "I have a permit," the merchant protests. The inspector shrugs. Your stall exceeds the authorized space. A fine applies. You overhear two fishermen discussing their latest bureaucratic hurdle. The catch quota changed again, one grumbles. "Now we need a new license for winter fishing." His friend nods bitterly. "And another for selling at the harbor instead of the market square." It's not just tradesmen who suffer. Farmers require land use certificates that specify what crops they can plant, when, and how much can be sold at market. A drought, too bad. The tax collector still expects payment based on previous quotas. You pass a small village where tax assessors arrive on horseback, accompanied by scribes carrying portable writing desks. They move from farm to farm, reviewing harvest estimates and livestock counts. One peasant protests, "The locusts ruined half my wheat." The assessor barely looks up. That's not recorded in the practicon. You owe what's listed. The peasants know better than to argue too hard. Imperial patience for non-compliance is famously thin. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars believe that Byzantine bureaucrats genuinely believed they were preserving order through these regulations. Others argue that the sheer complexity often created more opportunities for local officials to extort bribes or favors simply to help citizens navigate the maze. You pass a narrow alley where a professional petitioner, a decaiophylax, negotiates on behalf of a distressed widow. The land transfer requires the deceased husband's will confirmation of dowry payment bishop's notarization and the tax collector's certification. The widow blinks, overwhelmed. The petitioner smiles gently. "For a modest fee, I can assist." Even the church gets involved. Baptism certificates are cross-checked with imperial census rolls. Religious courts review marriage disputes before civil ones do. You hear a deacon explain to a nervous couple. Without proper baptismal documentation, your children's inheritance could be challenged. And when disaster strikes a fire, a flood, a military raid, the first priority isn't rebuilding. It's documenting the losses for tax adjustments and imperial relief petitions. Without paperwork, even tragedy becomes administratively invisible. You pass a small bakery where the owner mutters while reviewing his grain ledger. If I bake one loaf too many, the inspectors fine me. If I bake too few, they accuse me of hoarding. May the saints preserve me from auditors. Everywhere you go, you feel the invisible weight pressing down on these people. They aren't criminals. They aren't rebels. They're simply trying to survive inside a system where even the most mundane actions are subject to review, authorization, and verification. And yet, somehow they adapt. Families teach their children how to file petitions. Guilds hire legal advisors. Villages pool funds to hire scribes who know which officials to bribe, flatter, or pressure. The bureaucracy becomes not just a government, it becomes a way of life. As you leave the village, you hear one old man sigh to his grandson. Remember, boy, don't argue. Fill the forms, pay the fees, and always bring extra wine for the clerk. But even this delicate balancing act couldn't stop the rising tide of inefficiency, power struggles, and rigid red tape. And in the coming centuries, scholars would wrestle with the great unanswered question, did Byzantine bureaucracy save the empire or help doom it? That's where you're headed next. You now step back as if rising above the marble palaces and dusty village squares, hovering over the entire Byzantine landscape. From here, you see the great machine in full. A sprawling empire stitched together with parchment wax seals, crimson silk ribbons, and exhausted citizens endlessly feeding paperwork into its jaws. And yet, somehow it worked. For a time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Byzantine Empire lasted for more than 1,000 years. Far longer than its Western Roman sibling, longer than most empires in history. Many historians credit its bureaucratic system, rigid, layered, obsessive, as one of the key reasons for its extraordinary longevity. You watch the system pulse like a living organism, tax rolls updated, military rosters, logged trade routes, monitored church edicts, copied property transfers, registered and legal rulings sealed. Every breath of imperial life documented, filed, indexed, and archived. And your quirky tidbit. Some imperial documents from Justinian's reign were still legally binding centuries later. A land deed issued in the 6th century could still be hauled before a court in the 11th. Entire family fortunes hinged on who could find the oldest, most yellowed, most official scroll buried deep in some archive. But here's where it gets complicated. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic monster was a brilliant safeguard or a suffocating parasite. On one hand, its obsessive documentation created stability, especially compared to the chaos that plagued medieval Europe. On the other hand, as new laws, edicts, and taxes piled endlessly atop one another, the empire's administrative arteries slowly hardened. You hover now over a legal council where 3 officials argue not over what should be done, but over which of 6 contradictory laws applies. The tax code from Leo III conflicts with the exemption granted under Basil's edict, one says. But Emperor Romanos issued a clarification another insists. The third simply rubs his temples. This was Byzantium's greatest paradox, a system designed to create clarity instead generated endless ambiguity. And that ambiguity was both a curse and a shield. You descend into the office of a high-ranking eunuch who explains this strange balancing act to a nervous junior clerk. The law is not the answer, boy. The law is the chessboard. Your skill lies in knowing which piece to move. That's where the Byzantine genius truly shone. Navigating the system was itself a political art. Successful officials didn't necessarily enforce rules, they managed them, like delicate threads woven together into whatever shape best served the moment. But of course, this flexibility depended heavily on personal connections, informal favors, and the constant delicate game of bribery. As the centuries rolled on, access to imperial favor and to the bureaucratic shortcuts that came with it became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. You listen as 2 scholars quietly debate this very dilemma. The system preserved the empire for centuries, says one. Without it, Byzantium would have fractured like the West. His colleague shakes his head. No, it strangled innovation, bred resentment, and guaranteed collapse once competent rulers vanished. Both men fall silent as a clerk walks by clutching another bundle of freshly sealed petitions. The debate, like the paperwork, never really ends. And then there's the role of the church. You observe church courts operating side by side with imperial ones, creating yet another bureaucratic layer. Ecclesiastical law governed marriage, inheritance, property disputes, and even local administration. Sometimes church rulings conflicted with imperial law, forcing clever litigants to shop between systems like medieval legal tourists. Here's your fringe debate. Some modern historians believe the Byzantine bureaucracy was so complex that it acted like a shock absorber. Instead of quick collapses, the empire suffered slow, staggered declines, mini-crises absorbed by the system's own redundancy. Others argue that this very slowness prevented the kinds of sweeping reforms that might have saved Byzantium in its final centuries. You visit a distant province where a local governor complains to a traveling inspector. The forms have changed again. He sighs. New tax codes, revised military quotas, revised grain tariffs. And every edict requires 3 copies, one for the palace, one for the logothete, one for the archive. The inspector simply shrugs. Better too many records than too few. And yet, the emperor still sits secure in Constantinople, wrapped in silk, guarded by layers upon layers of scribes, notari, logothetes, and chamberlains. The machine rumbles on, fueled by its endless scrolls, even as enemies gather along its borders. You step away once more, gazing across the empire. The bureaucracy held everything in place until it didn't. Because as you'll soon witness, Byzantium's greatest strength would eventually become its greatest vulnerability. The paperwork never stopped, but the world around it changed. And slowly, inevitably, the collapse began. You drift forward now into the slow-motion unraveling of the empire, not with sudden drama or crashing collapse, but with an excruciatingly careful disintegration. This is not the fall of Rome, where barbarians sack a city and all is lost overnight. This is the Byzantine collapse, where bureaucracy outlives logic and red tape survives even as entire provinces fall away. You stand once again in the imperial palace, but something feels different. The marble is cracked in places. The silk banners hang a little thinner. The scribes still shuffle the seals, still drip onto parchment, but there's a kind of nervous energy, like everyone senses the foundation wobbling beneath them, but dares not say it aloud. Here's your mainstream historical fact. As Byzantium entered its final centuries, it faced mounting external threats. Ottoman Turks, Crusaders, Normans, Bulgarians, all while its bureaucratic machinery kept grinding forward, seemingly oblivious to the world closing in. You watch as officials still issue complex edicts on fishing regulations for the Bosporus, even as Turkish armies capture distant forts. A logothete reviews naval tax codes, while Venetian fleets sail circles around what's left of the Byzantine navy. The paperwork never stops, it just becomes more surreal. Your quirky tidbit. In the 14th century, some provinces were so isolated that local officials continued issuing tax receipts and marriage licenses under the emperor's name, despite not having seen an imperial inspector for decades. The paperwork simply continued as ritual disconnected from reality. Historians still argue whether this obsession with procedure contributed to the empire's survival or its undoing. On one hand, bureaucracy allowed the shrinking empire to function even with minimal resources. On the other, it delayed the bold reforms needed to face its crises. You walk now through a tax office in Thessalonica, where a harried clerk mutters to himself. The wheat quota remains unchanged. Never mind the drought, never mind the siege last year. The quota is the quota. A desperate farmer pleads his case, but the clerk only gestures helplessly at the scroll. If it's not written, I can't change it. The rigidity has become paralyzing. The law's once flexible tools now form brittle cages. Younger clerks follow rules without question. The older ones simply sigh, remembering days when bribes and favors at least offered escape routes. Now even corruption struggles under the weight of procedure. You observe a regional governor's council. Pirates raid coastal villages, yet the debate focuses not on defense, but on whether funds can legally be reallocated from temple repairs to hire mercenaries. Without imperial authorization, I cannot divert funds, one official insists. And the courier for Constantinople arrives only twice a year. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars suggest that in its final stages, Byzantine bureaucracy became a form of collective denial, a way for officials to pretend stability still existed as long as the paperwork looked correct. The empire died on paper last, even after its borders vanished. You pass a monastery where scribes still copy ancient imperial edicts, word for word binding them in fresh crimson ribbons, as though the world outside has not changed. The emperor's word is eternal, one monk whispers. You can't help but feel both awe and heartbreak at their faith in parchment. The emperor himself, now little more than the ruler of a glorified city-state, still receives endless petitions from across his shrinking realm. Marriage licenses from peasants, property disputes from minor nobles, appeals for tax relief, all arrive wrapped in familiar ribbons bearing wax seals of fading provinces long since conquered. In the heart of Constantinople, the Palace of Blackernay still buzzes with bureaucratic life. Eunuchs process ambassadorial credentials. Logothetes bicker over ceremonial precedents. Notari dutifully copy imperial decrees that will never reach half the lands they name. You overhear two minor officials discussing their situation with dry humor. At least the paperwork keeps us employed. The other chuckles, even if there's nothing left to govern. And then comes 1453. The Ottoman cannons roar outside the city walls. Gunpowder shakes the ancient stones. Yet inside, in the quieter corners of the palace, petitions are still being filed. Last-minute appointments are still notarized. Seals still cool on freshly tied ribbons. It's almost absurd the red tape outlives the walls themselves. As the city falls, some clerks burn records to prevent their misuse. Others frantically hide archives in monastery vaults. A few, astonishingly, keep copying documents even as the end arrives, like musicians playing as the ship sinks. And here's the ultimate irony: the Byzantine bureaucratic legacy does not die here. Fragments of its legal codes, administrative methods, and ceremonial protocols survive, adopted, borrowed, and modified by the very empires that replace it. You step now through the broken gates out into the world beyond Byzantium, but you're not done yet. Because as you'll see, Byzantine bureaucracy isn't truly gone. It's simply changed costumes, and you're still living with its legacy today. You emerge now from the ruins of Constantinople and step directly into the modern world, only to realize you haven't entirely left Byzantium behind. The paperwork, the forms, the endless signatures, the color-coded files, they're still here. They simply wear new clothes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many aspects of Byzantine bureaucracy directly influenced later European administrative systems. The Holy Roman Empire, Ottoman administration, even modern European civil service structures borrowed ideas from Byzantium's complex record-keeping legal traditions and hierarchical chains of authorization. You glance around any modern government office, whether it's renewing a passport, filing taxes, or registering property, and the Byzantine fingerprints are unmistakable. Your quirky tidbit. In some modern European legal systems, ancient Byzantine laws still echo faintly. The corpus juris civilis remained the foundation of many civil codes. In places like Germany, France, and parts of Eastern Europe, fragments of Justinian's great legal compilation quietly survive in today's statutes. Historians still argue whether Byzantium's administrative genius was a gift or curse to modern governance. Some scholars admire the empire's ability to create continuity through orderly systems. Others see it as the root of red tape's most frustrating excesses. You wander into a modern city hall where a frustrated citizen clutches a folder stuffed with forms. "You need Form A12 before we can process Form B22, the clerk explains with polite finality. The citizen sighs, muttering, "It's always one more signature." You can't help but smile knowingly. Justinian would be proud. Even today's obsession with notarization echoes Byzantium. You observe a notary public stamping documents with official seals, a wax substitute now made of ink and metal embossing. But the symbolism remains the same: authority, authenticity, and control. In some countries, you even find remnants of imperial ceremonial etiquette. The Byzantine obsession with proper greetings, ranked seating, and rigid protocols inspired court procedures that lingered in European monarchies for centuries. You visit a modern military base, where officers meticulously log equipment inventories, troop movements, and pay records. The Byzantine military bureaucracy would find this deeply familiar. The careful recording of who has how many spears or tanks remains a cornerstone of disciplined governance. Even surveillance, that murky Byzantine specialty, finds echoes in our age. Governments worldwide maintain sprawling intelligence networks, monitoring internal threats and foreign adversaries. Byzantium's Bureau of Barbarians would likely admire how their descendants refined the art of information, gathering into entire industries. And of course, there's the language. Phrases like red tape, rubber stamp, and paper trail owe their existence quite literally to practices pioneered in Byzantium's candlelit offices. You step into a modern university library where law students struggle over dense legal codes. Article 3 contradicts Article 7, but the footnote refers to a previous ruling. One mutters, sounding eerily like the scholars of Constantinople. Even our legal education system retains that Byzantine flavor: mastery of complexity over simplicity. Here's your fringe debate. Some contemporary political theorists wonder whether Byzantine-style bureaucracy might actually be humanity's most natural state, an attempt to tame the unpredictable messiness of human society with rules, forms, and procedures. Not perfect, but perhaps the only thing standing between order and chaos. You pause for a moment, letting this thought settle. Bureaucracy at its core is simply an attempt to impose predictability on unpredictability, a paper fortress against uncertainty. And yet, as you've seen through Byzantium's 1,000-year journey, that fortress can become a prison if left unchecked. Rules designed to protect can suffocate. Forms meant to clarify can confuse. Procedures that empower can entangle. You step back once more, gazing across history. From crimson silk ribbons to digital databases, from wax seals to biometric scans, the materials change. But the impulse remains the same: to organize, to control, to document. Byzantium may have fallen, but its ghost lingers in every government office, every waiting room, every please hold phone call you've ever endured. As the day fades, you smile wryly at the unbroken chain stretching across centuries, a chain lovingly bound in red tape. And now, let's wind things down together.